Good morning, Mr. Kokonis, and welcome to a virtual pink couch. I feel like we are in an August redux. It's August, same bat channel, different airline, strike pending. What is going on? Question one. But before we get to the nitty-gritty of WestJet's flight attendants' 72-hour strike notice, I want to ask you about your take on this whole ground pay, because ultimately Air Canada flight attendants, now WestJet flight attendants, this is the crux of the matter. And you have some historical information on how this has come to pass. And I think you also have some strong opinions on it. They may be controversial, but I want to hear them.
For sure. And I wish we could be meeting under different circumstances in the middle of a Canadian summer. We should all be out there doing great things with our tourism industry, right? But here we are again, as you just said. So the crux of the matter comes down to quote unquote unpaid time for ground functions, whether there's the time to prepare an aircraft for departure, ground delays, whatever it might be.
Yeah.
And WestJet's flight attendants organized under CUPE maintained they put in on average about 35 hours of unpaid work per month. You have to go back to about 2000, the negotiation of the last contract around 2021. The WestJet flight crews were paid what's called a duty pay formula. So every single aspect of their workday, ground pay, flight pay was all compensated. But when you added up all the bits, it wasn't the greatest pay in the world. And I think people recognize that. And the flight attendants asked for a change to more like the pilots are paid under a block pay. So by the time the aircraft pushes back from the gate to when it arrives, that's how pilots get paid. So the flight attendants wanted to change the block hour pay style, and the change was made. The company agreed, and of course, the pay rates for a block hour were quite different than the duty pay portions. And I know that the cabin crew were definitely better compensated under this new system. So fast forward to the year 2026, now the union is saying, well, no, we're not being paid for this ground time. We want that to be recognized. Well, no, you agreed to that back in 2021, this changed formula. All that said and done, the challenge that we're in, that the company's in right now, is that, as you said, last summer, the bar was set in terms of Air Canada agreeing to a new formula for their cabin crew for ground time, and that unfortunately is the situation we're in right now. So I think the company feels they agreed to a change in the formula to compensate ground time 5 years ago, but now the union wants to go back and revisit that and make changes. So again, I think that Air Canada agreement last year is the high watermark.
It's fascinating that you're saying this is a very unpopular view, I would imagine, amongst most people. There's a groundswell of support amongst Canadians that flight attendants in general are not being paid their due. You hear horror stories of flight attendants living out of their cars, taking food off the flights to feed their families. I think that the base pay is much lower, especially for new flight attendants without seniority than it was, say, 10, 20 years ago. And you are indicating that the situation the WestJet flight attendants find themselves in right now is of their own making. How do we square that with the fact that they are struggling financially?
I think that's a good point. I think that pilots are the same thing as well, with the same situation where the first 3, 4, 5 years when you're on reserve, you're not what we call a block holder. You're having to sit by the phone waiting for a call, whether you because you are in reserve is not easy. And like even pilots, I've got pilots spend a lot of money going through their personal and their commercial pilot license, all their training, all their ratings. It's an expensive venture, only to get into a carrier. And for the first 3 to 5 years, pay is kind of tough. So to the extent that some cabin crew don't make the world's greatest pay the first couple of years, but that's a choice they've got to make because they had to look downstream, like pilots say, right? By the time I reach, let's say, 5 or 7 years of seniority, Pay is
Right.
looking a lot better as they get more senior as a block holder. That's a personal decision they got to make. I mean, no company is a charity. I mean, here's our business. We know the airline business is a difficult business to make money
Very.
at the best of times. I mean, if you go back to like 2007, which is eons ago for you and I in this business, all the stuff that's happened since, but it was the most profitable year that decade, and the average profit margin for 250 carriers in the International Air Transport Association was literally about the 2.3 or 2.2%. If I take all of WestJet's annual revenues and divide by their passengers, you're down into a single digit dollars of revenue per passenger. It's a tough business. So labor costs are one of the places where there is some discretion amongst the carriers to, try to make a profitable business, and profitable being a very narrow profit. But again, I get what you say. I think in WestJet, like any other carrier around the world, it is desirous of having good relations with their labor groups, making sure that they can pay their staff to the optimal level possible. But it's got to be fair for both parties. And I do get the sense, having talked to both sides, that that they all want to get a settlement. WestJet has said that they recognize. I mean, the 2001 agreement. There's been a lot of inflation since then, so for sure. Pay rates have got to be adjusted. It's got to be fair, but you can't ask for a change in 2001, get the change you asked for, and then 5 years later, because you see what Air Canada settled for and want to make a change and go backwards in time. You can't have your cake and eat it too.
Well, even with the Air Canada settlement, the flight attendants are very unhappy with the ground
Oh,
pay. They don't feel it's enough at all. And so that argument is ongoing. But tell me something against this backdrop. Where do you see the negotiations going with the flight attendant union and WestJet, the airline? Because long weekends coming, everybody's very concerned.
for sure. And with the strike notice issued just after midnight last night, with their ability to go on strike by Sunday, what, 2:30, whatever the time is, AM,
Yeah.
that's tough. In a company like a WestJet or like Air Canada last year, you got to start thinking about, winding down, starting to cancel flights, and wind down the airline because you can't have expensive multi-million dollar assets and crews stranded around the world. Because when time comes, if there is job action, or a lockout by the company, which would likely happen before a strike, you can't when the time comes to restart a big network airline like a WestJet, you got to be able to get crews and airplanes back to where they got to operate from. You can't have airplanes stranded in Barcelona or in Tokyo or in Los Angeles or whatever. You've got to
A
get them back in
massive
place.
operation. We saw
Massive. And a lot of
last
people
year with
don't
Air
realize
Canada.
how big that is. But I
Yeah.
think the disappointing thing for all of us that have been in this business a long time, whether you're on the travel advisor side and the supplier side, working for an airline yourself or an airport, which is how is it in Canada, time and time again, we get to the edge of this cliff in when we have a labor threat during a peak travel season, March break, summer, the December holiday period. Is there not a better way of doing this? And I think we've got to revisit the Canada Labor Act and the CRRB, the Canada Industrial Relations Board. We've got to take a look at how we can do things differently. I'm not saying the American system's better, but they do have airline negotiations covered off by the Railway Labor Act, which has got very strict regs around about negotiations, about federal mediation, and you just see the parties coming together way before there's any risk of a strike. The last strike in the U.S., I think, was Spirit Airlines, now defunct, by the way. Spirit Airlines pilots way back in 2010. That's a long time ago. And we've had a lot more issues in Canada over the last decade as a minimum. So we can't
Right.
continue down this path. At the end of the day, aside from company profits or airports or other people like you and I that work in the related to the business, it's the passengers, it's the travelers, it's the family that's saved for 2 years to take their kids away on vacation. It's the people who've got sick or ailing parents located offshore that they need to go see them, or
And the
business
advisors who are
people.
dealing with massive rebookings.
Oh,
I mean,
huge.
my
A hu-
God, they're
and
caught in
that
the
and
middle.
that and you want to talk about unpaid work, right?
Yeah.
The cabin crew. I talked to one travel advisor at a Carlson Wagon Lee location that said the amount of additional work they
Yeah.
are having to put in for no pay to deal with this crisis is huge. Who's going to compensate them? So I think
One
that,
after another. Yeah.
we have to step back, and maybe it starts at the government level, I don't know, but the status quo way of running labor relations at an airline level is crazy. This country, big country, 5,000 kilometers east to west, 3,000 kilometers or more north to south. This country relies upon efficient air transportation for people and cargo. We cannot, is a critical enabler in this country.
Vital. Yeah. And
Vital.
you're right. Something is broken. Clearly, we can't keep having strike after strike. There's no question. Although I think most of the contracts are being renegotiated for the next 5 years, we might be safe. But no, there's no question that this needs to be looked at and addressed because, as you say, the advisors, the consumer are all the ones who have to pay for it in the end. So the last time we heard from WestJet QP Union was that they are still very far apart in terms of coming to an agreement. Are you hearing the same thing?
Well, one can say that's a public negotiating position to say that to put pressure on the other side. It could be. I think that they are pretty entrenched, but I'm still hopeful because
Okay.
QP understands as well for their members. It's not a great situation to have a strike. And then you take reputational hit. Although I'm somewhat on reputational hit, although there will be some, if there is job action, some reputational hit to WestJet. At the end of the day, people do look for, value fares and vacations. And I'm sure just like Air Canada did, you've got to go to the market and offer all sorts of baubles and good things and fares and bonus points to get people back in the airplane. Because yeah, after a couple of months, everybody forgets about the job action, goes from there. But in the immediate hit, it is tough. So I like to be the eternal optimist and think that the parties of both sides of the table will figure out a way to come together because it really is in nobody's best interest to have a job action.
Agreed. Thank you so much for your wisdom as always, Rob. Love chatting with you about these issues. I'm sure we could actually go on and delve further into it. But I have to publish this so that we can get the news out. Thank you, Rob. Appreciate it.
Crossing my fingers. Bye.
Same here.